I hope that you all feel heartily welcome to this seminar today on the Western Balkans, an unfinished business in Euro-Transatlantic Security Co-operation. We're especially happy to see that there are several ambassadors here because we have a somewhat unexpected competition from a guy called Fredrik Reinfeldt. He has called them to a briefing at 2 o'clock, so we really appreciate those, the presence of those who are here, but we understand that you have to run later on. This is the fifth seminar on security policy and the transatlantic link that the Swedish Atlantic Council arranges together with Försvar. We started in December 2010 with a NATO strategic concept, which then had just been adopted. Then we followed up with a conference on Nordic cooperation and the transatlantic link. Europe and EU and the transatlantic link was the next one. And last year we looked at the trends in the Baltic Sea region in a transatlantic perspective. Today's seminar on the Western Balkans will focus on the most comprehensive transatlantic activity that we've seen since the fall of the Berlin Wall. But it is still an unfinished business. After a broad and detailed description by two persons who've been, both of them actors, important actors in this region, and that is Michael Salin and Peter Faith. We will concentrate later on then, after them, on what could be seen as three case studies with the distinguished speakers who will be introduced later. First, of course, what historical lessons have we learned from Srebrenica? Second, the still lingering problems of corruption and organized crime in the area. And third, looking forward, Serbia as the key player for the future. For technical reasons, the order has been a little bit blurred and changed, but this is the thought behind it. And we're happy to have these extremely knowledgeable personalities here to discuss these important issues. I'd like to pay tribute to Lars Ekeman of Försvar, who came up with the idea of discussing the theme of corruption and organized crime in the security context. We think that a discussion of this feature of security policy will bring a very valuable contribution to the general picture. And in this respect, I would also then like to remind ourselves of other aspects of soft security and of what the transatlantic cooperation is about. That is securing respect for democracy and human rights. Today we see, for instance, alarming trends of extreme nationalism and xenophobia, as well as maltreatment of minorities, not only in the Western Balkans, but also in the rest of Europe, including the area where we are right now. We will not be able to discuss these security threats today, but we should keep them in mind and scrutinize prevailing policies thoroughly in order to make it absolutely sure that we live up to those high ideals internally and externally. Otherwise, our common security will be at risk in the longer perspective. And with this expression of appreciation for our cooperation with Försvar, I'd like to give the floor to today's moderator, the Secretary General of Försvar, Lena Bartelsson.
Well, thank you very much, Mats. And on behalf of Folk och Försvar, or Society in Defense, I would also like to welcome you all to this seminar. And I wish to thank the Swedish Atlantic Council, in particular Mats Åberg and Mikael Salin, of course, for making this seminar a reality today. It has been a great cooperation indeed, and we are privileged to have a number of distinguished and very qualified speakers in the program of today, as Mats mentioned. And you are all also very welcome to participate with questions or comments throughout the seminar. However, we do have a very tight schedule, so I would like to ask you already to keep this in mind, so we keep the time for this seminar. And now I would just briefly like to once again welcome you to this seminar and leave the floor to the first speaker, who is Mikael Salin. Mikael Salin is the president of the Swedish Atlantic Council, and he has served as ambassador in a number of countries. He's, for example, the former Swedish ambassador to Belgrade and Skopje, and former EU special representative to the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. And he will set a regional context and share some reflections with us on problems and prospects. Welcome, Mikael Salin.
Work? Yes. Thank you, and thank you for welcoming words, and thank you all for coming here. I feel that in trying to lay some foundations for this conference and its theme, it is very important for me to highlight, Lena, the fact that we have several of all those Swedes that have contributed to these enormous efforts in stabilizing the Western Balkans throughout the years, including, I see at least 1, 2, 3 former ambassadors from Sarajevo of Sweden here, and I see the current ambassador in Croatia, my comrade in arms in Belgrade, Lars Schmidt, and many, many others. So we have a very knowledgeable audience, which is fine, and we are going to all regret having so short time for this very important theme. I would like to start by saying that reflecting some 20 years after peace began to establish itself, regain foothold in the Western Balkans, one is reminded of the significance of the Western Balkans as an arena for transatlantic security cooperation. All the efforts that were done in peace enforcement, in peacemaking, all the acronym words of peace, peace building, what have you, all the setbacks that occurred, one of them, of course, Bopelnes being Srebrenica, and others implying that we were all involved in the process of learning lessons. So the importance of the Western Balkans in being a laboratory of the post-Cold War attempts by all international players, including NATO, including the EU, including the UN and others, OSCE. The importance of this cannot be overstated and needs a lot of retroactive thinking. So it's high time to assess what all this ended up with as we look at today. This year is 2013, and it has seen some important steps of progress, if progress is measured in terms of accession, the accession process. When I speak about accession, I mean to the EU, to NATO, and as part of an overall peace-building process, let's say. There have been some points, useful points. On the 19th of May, there was an agreement after a lot of EU diplomacy between Serbia and Kosovo that seemed at the time at least to be a small and helpful step compared to not having taken those steps, although many would highlight also shortcomings. Still, that happened, and I think this was very, very important, seen to be very important for the EU as a lead agency for peace in the Western Balkans. Then came Croatia becoming a full member of the EU on the 1st of July, an important step. I hope you agree with that, Lars Schmidt. And then came the progress report of the Commission in the fall, when the Commission recommended that Albania, big surprise to many, be mentioned as formally a candidate for membership of the EU, Albania having already in 2006 become a member of NATO, exemplifying the difference of criteria between NATO and the EU. And also that Serbia should be welcome to start negotiations as from New Year. So even as we speak now, the question is, will the General Affairs Council, the foreign ministers, and then the summit follow the advice of the Commission in concerning those two cases? And if so, it will be highlighted and I guess celebrated also as not unimportant steps in a very slow but still process of accession and of peace building. And this builds on other steps, similar steps, like when Albania and Croatia became members of NATO in 2006, and when Macedonia, the former Yugoslav Republic, I will henceforth say Macedonia, I hope it's okay, became an EU formal candidate in 2005. So this is one perspective, that small steps are taken step by step. But then there is the other side of the coin. And today, in analyses of the Western Balkans, there is a tendency for some gloom to prevail or to predominate when assessing analytically where the involved countries are in fact heading. I will give you some voices, and one of those voices portraying this element of gloom is a friend of mine, one too many, whom I asked, and he's a veteran diplomat following Balkans events ever since very long time ago. So I asked him, so what is your assessment concerning where the Western Balkans is right now? And I will take the risk of quoting the answer to that. This person says, the topic of where the Western Balkans is now heading is occupying a lot of my thinking time these days, as there are many, many festering problems which have the potential to rise quickly to violence. In short, Montenegro seems calm, but Milo, meaning Djukanovic, is losing enough of his support in local elections to make his opposition very confident of winning the next elections at national level. And then he concludes on Montenegro, saying that if the current newly elected prime minister feels that he risks losing power, he will feel that he will either be arrested, killed, or on the run to Belarus, not sure which would be worse. Bosnia continues to be a failed state, and we in the West continue to adhere to policies which will ensure it stays that way. Macedonia is now really two different countries meeting in Skopje and being watched with interest by Greece and Bulgaria, not to mention the Kosovo Albanians. The Sanjak has a lot of potential for violence and separatist activity in some. We are spending a lot of time, justified, trying to normalize the Kosovo situation, but almost no time on these other issues, unfortunately. With best regards from this person whom some of you know. I'm using this as an example of a possible portrayal of trends in the Western Balkans. I could have quoted many others, of course, one of them being Mrs. Holbrooke, Katie Martin, who wrote in the New York Times only the other day a very gloomy article, mainly about Bosnia, titled, I have it here somewhere, titled Bosnia in Peril Once More. But I will not take your time quoting her, but it has a very funny remark about the way the US has surrendered to the EU, taking the lead in being responsible for how to implement the Dayton Agreement in creating peace in that part of the Western Balkans. And then she says, how foolish for the US to make such a surrender. What is the EU doing? She says, well, the EU has a high representative, an Austrian diplomat who spends 2 days in Sarajevo and the rest of his time catering his horses in Vienna. So you encounter sharp comments these days like that. And that, of course, has to do with the following points. That the name issue between Greece and Macedonia has led to, in spite of the progress that Peter Fate and I were there to help administer, there has been no negotiation started, neither with NATO nor with the EU. And in the waiting game being played there, because of the name issue, ethnic relations between Slav Macedonians and Albanians in that country, the Albanian minority, are clearly souring, hence this comment from my friend. That Serb-Albanian relations also in Kosovo are still problematic in spite of this deal brokered by the EU. In today's newspaper, I don't know if any one of you noticed, but there was a little news item in Dagens Nyheter at least, saying that the result of the local elections in Kosovo, the one that had to be redone in northern Kosovo, northern Mitrovica, led to two extreme nationalists on the two sides, the Albanian and Serbian sides, winning. And that is, of course, making a difficult task not less difficult. So you have that. Corruption or organized crime, of course, when there is no political stability, corruption and organized crime tends to be given space in the political culture. The fact also that the EU and the international community as a whole struggle with the issue of, or the dilemma of whether to maintain and for how long to maintain executive presence in the countries of the Western Balkans where they are now. You have the OHR in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and you have EULEX, ANMIC, KFOR in Kosovo, for example. I will come back to this dilemma, because I really think it is a dilemma. I know Peter Fate has strong views about this case as well. So there's a lot of attempts to be made, but also dilemmas to fight. Coming now to the issue of the dilemma of executive presence and how long to keep it, lest the mission creep function starts kicking in, and lest also the mission in itself is a creator of corruption problems. We may hear something about this later today. But I will make this discours to Macedonia and my own personal experience. In Macedonia, like in the other Western Balkan countries, there was a step-by-step approach. First, vain diplomatic attempts to stop the fighting and find some kind of peace accord. Only when military power was added to those efforts was it possible to reach such accords. And in the case of Macedonia, it became first a NATO military mission, then an EU military mission, and then an EU police mission. creating an executive presence in order to help or impose the implementation of this peace agreement, the Ohrid peace agreement. By 2004-2005, as Peter will recall, the issue became one where we in the EU and we other internationals in Macedonia felt that there was a growing paradox, a growing contradiction between, on the one hand, stating for a fact that stabilization and accession is an intended process. Stabilization was still needed. There were many crises in those days. On the other hand, there was a strong political will at the time in Brussels to have and help Macedonia become a candidate for membership so that the accession part would start kicking in. And then the dilemma became, so how about stabilization and accession? Can they occur at the same time, or must it be consecutive stages in a process? And this sounds like a theoretical concept. It's not, because it really involves who does what. In the case of Macedonia, at the time, it was whether the Commission should be responsible for the accession process and kicking out the representatives of the stabilization or not. And in the end, in the case of Macedonia, the outcome became, all right, you have one representative, he has two hats from now on. And that, of course, was a step towards the new structure under the Lisbon Treaty. But it was also imitated later in Bosnia. So making this comparison with Macedonia, one quickly gets to the current situation in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where similarly, and I would say similarly also in Kosovo, the issue has become, and has for a long time been, to what extent is it helpful or not, and in what respect, to maintain an executive presence because stabilization so requires, or to what extent is it instead counterproductive to maintain for a long time an executive presence, only to see perhaps that this presence in itself both deprives the country from the necessary element of accountability. Maturity is a word sometimes liked, so that politicians really take the full responsibility, or to what extent do we feel that this may be so, but we still need stabilization, because we do not dare let the country lose on its own because of the investment made and the prestige factors involved. So you have this reason for kicking the can down the road in terms of a dilemma, and you have the UN, the mandating power, and its Security Council ruling that in the case of Bosnia, the presence of internationals with executive powers to make legislation, to undermine legislation that is wrongly decided by the local politicians, depends on us determining, us, the UN Security Council, determining that the situation in the country constitutes a threat to international peace and security, and that we are therefore acting under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. I will approach the end of this very short introduction, since Lena has stood up now, an agreed signal, by saying that the big issue is, in my view, but there are many views represented here, not only in the panel, whether and to what extent we still believe that this accession process linked to stabilization is the cure, is the way to help those countries solve the problems that were caused by the fall of Yugoslavia. Because we are, after all, talking about former Yugoslavia plus Albania. To what extent these will help overcome the inter-ethnic rivalries, conflicts that have been somehow ingrained in the political culture of these countries, If we believe so, then we must endure and keep pushing, even if, as in the case of Bosnia-Herzegovina, it seems almost impossible to persuade the players acting under the Dayton-based constitution that they have to be willing to create strong central institutions necessary for the state and nation building in that country. And at what time do we come to a point where it is proven to be pointless? In the case of Bosnia, we have the Finji-Selji case exemplifying that the inter-ethnic composition of the constitution means that you have a presidency of 3 categories, 1 Croat, 1 Serbian, 1 Bosniak. And what about the others? What about Jews or Roma or others? And the European Court has ruled that this is against the convention. And therefore we, the internationals, insist that they must change this, allowing for also others. But how to achieve that? So finally, there are structural problems still remaining to be solved. Renewed conflict cannot yet be excluded. But in any case, we must, I think, reinvigorate the accession process, because the way things look now, it is not even certain that developments are moving in the right direction. They are certainly moving very slowly. Thank you.
It's my great, here it comes. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce the next speaker, who is Peter Faith, who is a senior diplomat and international crisis management expert from the Netherlands. Peter Faith, he has had a number of high-level postings in the Balkans, and his most recent mission was as international civilian representative for Kosovo in 2008 until 2012. And I would like to welcome you very much, and your topic is Macedonia and Kosovo, transatlantic challenges with a question mark. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Lena. Let me thank, first of all, Michael for inviting me, Mats for organizing this, Lena, you for introducing me, and let me say how privileged I feel to be able to speak to this audience and see faces that I have seen before, and it's a pleasure to see you again. I feel the pressure of Staatsminister behind me, so I have to make sure that I conclude well in time. I'm a bit more optimistic than the previous speaker. If you're not an optimist, then don't go into crisis management, I always say. And I certainly agree that there is unfinished business in the Balkans, but I would like to quickly make some comments on the state of affairs in the 2 countries that I have been assigned to, Kosovo and Macedonia, and see what unfinished business there is, and then end with the question whose unfinished business it would be if there is unfinished business. Well, on Macedonia, I don't think I should repeat what Michael has said. I'm not the greatest expert on Macedonia. I have consulted a person who was also a special representative in that country, Erwan Fouré, who had the challenge to tread into the big footsteps that were left behind by Ambassador Salin. And he published a paper for the Center of European Policy Studies that starts by saying that Macedonia is a country in crisis. Indeed, it is a country in deep trouble. Now, there are three areas of concern that I do recognize also from my previous activities in Macedonia in 2001. One is the continuing mistrust among the political parties. And I remember in the spring of 2001, Javier Solana spending an enormous amount of energy to get President Trajkovski to reunite all the leaders of the country, all the leaders in the Macedonian parliament, to get them to agree a certain program. If you read the progress report of the Commission on Macedonia, then you will see what has happened over the past years. Of course, you will be aware that in 2012, there was a boycott in the parliament. The opposition parties left. Then there was a political agreement, and there was a committee of inquiry whose recommendations still need to be implemented. But it is not clear yet in how far this will help the reform process move forward. And the legal and policy frameworks, of course, need to be implemented, and for that you need to have a certain national consensus. And that is still the problem in Macedonia. That is that the willingness to move towards compromise, consensus, or even to consensus is still very weak. There is a zero-sums thinking prevalent in Macedonia as elsewhere, I must say, in the Balkans, which means that anything that would be beneficial to my opponent would necessarily be bad for myself. The problem is also with the freedom of the media, ladies and gentlemen. The dialogue on freedom of the media has stalled. There is significant polarization in the media, and this was the case as well in 2001. The second point, the second area of concern in Macedonia, in my view, is the intolerance of minority groups. In 2011, I was invited to attend a commemoration of the signature of the Ohrid Agreement. And this was a nice event. There were many internationals who had played a part. But what struck me was that those who were present were mainly Albanians and internationals. In other words, the representatives of the Slav majority were largely absent. It was not their party. And the mindset is still not very positive and cherry towards the whole process leading up to the Ohrid Agreement. And the third point is, of course, the one that Michael already touched upon, that is the name issue. It's not clear to me if the name issue, if it were to be solved, if that would help the other problems improve. But it is certainly true that the Albanians draw the conclusion from the ongoing impasse on the name issue that they want to join the European Union and NATO as soon as possible. The name issue leads to, I have to be careful on how I express this, but it leads to a certain feeling of paranoia, of uncertainty. Uncertainty about the national identity in Macedonia. And this in turn certainly feeds some of this rather obscene manifestations of nationalism that you see in the capital. Let me now move to Kosovo, where perhaps I can speak with a little bit more authority. And here, of course, I first want to salute Deputy Prime Minister Aydin Kuçi, with whom I've worked for 4.5 years in Kosovo in the most pleasant and constructive way. We have seen the outcome of the elections over the weekend, the second round municipal elections, and I believe that this is where Kosovo is to be commended and where we can find inspiration, because I think that the outcome of these elections showed that democracy is maturing in that country. It's better in that respect than in Macedonia, where the fundamentals of democracy are still not in place. The willingness to accept power sharing and the willingness of political parties to recognize defeat or to accept the losses. In Kosovo, I spent 4.5 years as the international civilian representative. This, ladies and gentlemen, I thought was a small transatlantic project. We worked together, and indeed the organization was staffed half by Europeans, half by Americans. And it brought together the leverage of the European Union and of the United States of America. We exited in September 2012, the Ahtisaari plan having been implemented to a large extent, not for 100%, but to a large extent. And the exit was rather quiet. I think, having consulted the press over the past months, I didn't see much reference to the ICO anymore. But that was only to the good. Because I believe very strongly in local ownership and local responsibility. So what we did was to set up the institutions of the independent Republic of Kosovo. With a particular emphasis to decentralization and to empowering the rights of the Serb community. We created municipalities. And for the Serbs, we succeeded in having 5 municipalities south of the river Ibar set up and starting to run. Decentralization is in accordance with the European Charter for Local Self-Government, is something, is a force for good, I would say. It improves governance. Kosovo is a 2-tier governance system. You have the central authorities, the central government, and you have the municipalities. And we thought, at least Ahtisaari and his wise founding fathers thought that decentralization would be the best way to ensure good governance, and I think indeed it is. In parentheses, I cannot refrain myself from saying also that decentralization may lead to corruption because certain municipalities are better at governance than others. And this is not only true as far as the Balkans is concerned. I have the good fortune of being skriven in Sverige and to live in Skåne, not far from Staffanstorp, if you know what I mean. And so stuff happens at the municipal level, but on the other side, in the Kosovo context, it was helpful to empower the Serbs. What we didn't achieve was the north. We couldn't implement the Ahtisaari provisions in the north of Kosovo because of the absolute refusal of Belgrade to work with us on the implementation of the plan, even though it was in the interest of the Serb community, we thought. And the EU, at the end of my mandate, made it quite clear that it was time for me to go and to let themselves, Lady Ashton in person, start up the dialogue between Belgrade and Kosovo. And I think that was indeed a very wise step, and it became a huge success. I should say that I helped this process along, and I think we ensured a smooth process. And yet, ladies and gentlemen, there are a few questions I need to ask myself, looking at where we are with the north of Kosovo. Because the substance of what it's all about is, again, in the comprehensive settlement plan of President Ahtisaari. It is about creating an association of Serb municipalities. But it would have certain limits. Again, as I told you, it's a two-tier governance system in Kosovo. And it is certainly not the intention to let this association of Serb municipalities become a third layer in governance between the government in Pristina and the municipalities. So, that is one question. What will be the competencies of this association? Will it have a leadership that will be elected, or will it be appointed? Will it cover both the municipalities in the north and in the south, or will there be differences between the autonomy rights between the two communities of Serbs? That's one question. The other question is, the dialogue has been led very much top-down, but the question remains, how can we convince, or how can the EU convince the Serbs in the north about the benefits for them? In other words, there needs to be some bottom-up approach as well. How can we approach Mr. Pantic, who has been elected and who has gained legitimacy, but who has made as a first statement that he would never recognize Kosovo? This will be a potential for serious tensions. And then my last question on this issue is, what are Belgrade's intentions? Is it the intention of Belgrade to develop this association of municipalities in Kosovo for the benefit of the community of Serbs and in order to let them integrate in Kosovo? Or is it to throw a spanner in the project of Kosovo's independence, to sabotage it from within, as it were? That question is still unanswered. I'm coming to the end, because Staatsminister is getting impatient. Whose unfinished business is all of this? Well, I would say primarily it's for the governments in question. That is the government of Macedonia and the government of Kosovo to deal with these issues. They have to reach out to their minorities. They have to ensure a greater convergence among the political parties. It is local ownership. But if they need assistance, I think it should come from Brussels. It's not because I've been working for 10 years in the Council Secretariat that I'm sounding so pro-European. But I think really that the period of crisis management has come to an end. And you can't have it both ways. Either you let Ashton run the show, or we're going back to a period where the Americans come in and we have to resort to executive authority. I think that's a period that has now been closed for good, I would hope. Which is not to say that we can be confident that there is enough pull factor coming from Brussels. There is enough attraction for the Balkanese peoples to do the necessary work on reforms and peace building and nation building. I don't believe that enlargement is going to happen. Perhaps not anymore, ever. Maybe I sound a bit Dutch, Eurosceptic, but there are serious questions if in our populations the idea of enlargement is still something we can entertain. But let's assume that the process of accession will be able to continue, and that by itself will already have enough, will provide enough leverage in the Balkans. Look at what happens in Ukraine at this moment. Will they turn to the European Union, or will they stay with Russia? That's also a part of the same problem of knowing exactly how much attraction the European Union can still exercise. The United States, forget about it. Ms. Morton can bemoan the actions of the European Union. The administration of President Obama has already decided a couple of years ago that the whole scene should be now left to the Europeans. It's up to them to control this. They will be in quiet support, but they're not going to take over anymore. Their priorities lie elsewhere, perhaps even in Asia. So the end state is reconciliation, normalization, approximation to the acquis, all very technical and terribly boring, ladies and gentlemen. The crisis management fund is over. However, there are two red lines that I would like to mention as an exception, where we may have to revert to a crisis mode. One is, if the name issue in Macedonia is going to continue forever, and not forever, but perhaps for another year, it may be necessary for some outside force to exercise some real pressure on Greece in particular, but also on Prime Minister Gruevski. I can see Angela Merkel, Germany, playing that role. That may be necessary. The second exception is if the Association of Serb Municipalities under the leadership of Mayor Pantic is going to lead to a Kosovo becoming ungovernable, and the people of Kosovo drawing the conclusion that they will have to resist this, then another situation may have to set in. And I think it's therefore prudent that NATO continues to maintain a presence in the north of Kosovo. Otherwise, my view is, and I'm being a little bit provocative, of course, as you can understand, but my view is leave it all to Commissioner Füle and DG Enlargement, because they know how to manage the process in the Balkans. Thank you very much.
I would like to ask Mikael Sain to join us, and please, Peter Faith, stay here, and so we have a couple of minutes for questions and discussion. And I will, of course, welcome. Thank you. Will be a microphone for you coming very soon. Meanwhile, Dario, if you come with the microphone. Meanwhile, can I just ask you, because there are the Western Balkans consist of a couple of countries, and they are quite diverse, as we hear. And are there any things that you see that they do actually have in common, or are they actually very different cases? Can I assist you maybe with this? So, Mikael, if you would like to start.
I will try, but I will first make sure that I understood you, Peter, very well if you keep struggling with your machine. Because you did mention two cases where crisis management will still be necessary, but you didn't mention Bosnia in that group of issues which delighted the optimists among us that you didn't. For me, it has always been former Yugoslavia, and then there is Albania, somehow making two groupings, and within the grouping of former Yugoslav countries, there are the similarities of all having a past as ex-communists and as ex-conflict countries, so that if they are to be transformed into as the UN Security Council resolution says, and then a long list of normal European, a lot of nice words like this, nations, then they have to get rid of both these backlogs, so to speak. But then the difference is those countries that have big inter-ethnic integration challenges and those that have less. And of course, you have the triad of Croats, Serbian, and Bosniaks in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and you have the Macedonian and Serbian, Slav and Albanian relationships in the two countries of Macedonia and Kosovo. Less so in Albania, obviously, and less so also in Montenegro, although you have the Sanjak problem that may be still festering. So You can build like this
Yeah.
similarities, the background, but the structure making every case unique.
Yes. Peter, Faith,
Well,
would you like to add?
on Bosnia, I think that the real problem is one of constitutional reform, and that's why I think that Mrs. Mortens, who is the widow of Dick Holbrooke, as we know, her comments ring so hollow because Dayton was an American-imposed peace agreement, and we were all very happy with Dayton, and Holbrooke did a magnificent job. But the problem of Bosnia now is that you cannot change the Dayton Accords. Not even Mr. Füle, not Mr. Salin, Mr. Veit, nobody can change it unless you have an agreement among the people as represented in their parliament. So my answer to what can we do in Bosnia is let them sort it out themselves. I think we have to wait and see till they come to their senses. There is continuous dialogue with the European Union on what needs to be done. Sometimes there are some steps in the right direction, then it goes back again. But there is already a man who is spending more time on grooming his horses. Do we need another person there with executive authority? I don't see how he can exercise a useful mandate, quite frankly. And therefore, Bosnia will have to accept that the speed, the time for it to move forward on the accession ladder will be slow and will be much slower. I foresee that Kosovo will overtake Bosnia very soon. I hope that the dialogue based on the Stabilization Association Agreement can be implemented as quickly as possible, and that with the 5 member states who do not recognize Kosovo, we can find a mode that would allow Kosovo to move even higher up. That would be my approach.
Okay, please introduce yourself. Also.
Thank you. I'm Biljana Stefanovska from the Embassy of Macedonia. And I will try first to clarify one of your dilemma, Mr. Peter Veit, whether the resolution of name issue will settle all other problems regarding the reforms and continuing accession to the European Union and NATO. And my simple answer will be yes. Actually, the name issue is the sole obstacle who is preventing Macedonia to continue its process. With respect to NATO, it's clear and it is repeatedly announced at every meeting and even in NATO summits that Macedonia is already ready to join NATO, and in fact with its participation in missions it's acting as a de facto member state. So the name issue is here the sole obstacle. With regards to the accession to the European Union process, again the Commission has 5 times repeated that it deserves. So the Council does not approve the process to go further. Instead of that dilemma, I will pose another dilemma. Whether it is not the issue of credibility of the enlargement process itself and credibility of EU institutions, when one institution is repeatedly encouraging the country and the other institution is not allowing that. And one small comment about the Kosovo and Macedonia as seen as in package with regards to Euro-Atlantic integration. I will not agree with that. They are far away. As I mentioned, Macedonia is ready to join NATO, and the challenges are not the same, even the inter-ethnic relations. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your comments. Can we just bring in one more question in the back, please? There is a microphone coming.
Rohan Kostic, Uppsala University. I have one question that deals to both of you in terms of commonalities in the Balkans and challenges ahead. And my feeling is that the whole idea of what we see in the Balkans today is economic failure, collapse of welfare state, lack of jobs. And it seems to be very common for Slovenia, Croatia, and other countries alike, regardless of being part of EU or outside. The question is, what we also see is the emergence of predatorial state in the Balkans, whereby the state is becoming a function of transferring public funds to private pockets of few. That also leads to corruption. If you look at Slovenia, you have Igor Bavčar, you have Janez Janša, you have Ivo Sanader in Croatia, you have issues of Lagumdžija, Dodik, anybody in Bosnia and Herzegovina who is in politics is accused of being corrupt and dealing with the private firms. This also goes to Serbia with Mišković and others. The question is, how do we really resolve the key issue of economic failure in the Balkans? Because clearly this is the issue that leads into mobilization, into xenophobia, into extremism that you see also in Slovenia, in Croatia, in Kosovo. You see it also in Serbia today. So it's a common problem. And the issue is that, I asked this many times in different conferences, what's the economic policy that will lead to self-sustained growth in the Balkans, from Slovenia down to Albania? Thank you.
Thank you very much. If Mr. Faith would like to start, and then we will round up with this final remarks. So.
Very briefly, I see this primarily as a rule of law issue. Because if there is no strong rule of law in these countries, foreign direct investment will stay away and move to other countries. Kosovo is missing out on opportunities because Macedonia may be more attractive. Which is not to say that there is better rule of law there, but I think, and we're going to discuss corruption and rule of law issues later, but it is important that there are competent and independent courts, credible legislation that is being implemented, not only being drafted, but also implemented, and that there is transparency in the system, in the banking system in particular. Now we know that in Kosovo, for instance, unemployment is over 40%. Over 40% of the people are living below the poverty line. So those are enormous challenges. And I agree that the international community, and I take part of the blame, but also the United Nations before me as the administering power, did not do enough to stimulate economic growth. But I believe that if the rule of law can be improved, I would like to see one of the mayors in Kosovo. I hope that Deputy Prime Minister Kuci will not take offense. But I know that, in Skenderaj or in Prizren, there are mayors who are. I don't want to condemn anybody, but I have gravest doubts about their integrity. I would like to see people once not only be indicted, but also be condemned and to serve prison sentences. That would be a very healthy sign of an improving rule of law.
Thank you. Mikael Salin.
Very brief comment. I would agree with you, Madam, that the issue is also one of credibility and the delivery capability of the Union actually to deliver on its promises. That is an issue as well. Just as a brief remark from my stay in Macedonia. And of course, there is an interaction always between rule of law development, assistance, homegrown development. But the question here is, to what extent is lacking of such things a result of lacking accession process? And to what extent is it part of a broader economic crisis now hitting those countries as well? So maybe one shouldn't be so sure that there is a cause-effect relationship, but it's a real problem and a really genuine concern. But rule of law is the key.
And we will speak more about that after the coffee break. But before we go out and have our coffee, I would like to thank you so much to Mr. Faith and also to Mikael Salin, of course. And I would like to give you a warm applause, of course. Coffee break for 15 minutes. Welcome back.
I'm still curious want to